Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. When I graduated from seminary in 2017, my mother asked me an impossible question, and that was to pick my 3 favorite Bible verses, which is like asking an English teacher to pick their 3 favorite books. It's just impossible. So I just had to do the best I could in the moment, and this verse from 1 John made the list. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. For me, those verses sum up what it means, or at least what it should mean, to be a Christian. It is about love, abiding in the love of God and giving that love to our neighbors in the world. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. As presiding Bishop Michael Curry says, if it's not about love, it's not about God. So abide will be our word of the day. It is an old word that isn't used much outside of church contexts anymore, and it means to dwell, to live, to remain, to stay put, to linger in one place, to abide. This isn't a word that implies a lot of action. It's a word of being rather than doing. To abide is to stay, not to go. To be, not to do. Which isn't that interesting? To be associated with a passage on love, we have this verb that doesn't imply much movement at all. I think of loving as a verb usually. We show our love through our actions. We help others. We show affection in our touch. We give gifts. We speak words of love. We do activities together. And if you're a savvy listener, you might notice those are Gary Chapman's 5 love languages. We show our love in actions. But to abide is to be with, not to do for. A word of being, not doing. What do we make of this? I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch that bears no fruit, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. Jesus is forever making these I am statements to help his followers figure out who he is and how he relates to them and how he relates to God. And when I read these lines, I really wished that I was a gardener so that I could understand the metaphor a little better. Some of you in this room probably can. But it seems to me, as somebody who is not a gardener, that the vines that bore fruit and the vines that didn't bear fruit got the same treatment. They were both cut. Because pruning, after all, is strategic cutting to help shape the plant and help it thrive. How interesting, then, that being a healthy branch doesn't mean one is exempt from the shears. Being a good branch doesn't prevent painful things from happening to us or mean that there aren't things in our lives that should be trimmed away. Interesting. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now we come to the point of the message. In order for us to bear fruit in our lives, we must abide in Jesus. And if abide means to be rather than to do, how do we abide with Jesus? And what fruit are we meant to be producing? For the fruit, I tend to go back to 1 John, love. Beloved, let us love one another. Love is the fruit we are meant to produce, and in order to do that, we must abide, to be, to remain with Jesus. To abide with Jesus is to be with, to live with, to remain with, to stay with, to linger with Jesus. Years ago, the counselor I was seeing took me out of the office onto a bench by the water in Old Town Silverdale, and we sat on this bench in the sunshine, let our legs dangle, and for a long time, we didn't talk at all. And you might be thinking, you paid her for that, Hilary. But I did. We listened to the water, we smelled the air, we watched the birds and the fish. There were some crazy teenagers jumping off into the water, which I'm sure was freezing. And for a few minutes, that was the therapy I needed most, just to sit and be. To abide with another person in the sunshine. There was something so healing about it that I still remember it years later. I don't remember a thing about what I was talking about that day, but I remember sitting in the sunshine. I think our spiritual lives could use more being and less doing. Spiritual practices are how we connect with Jesus, with the divine, with the great love in the universe. Many spiritual practices and ways of prayer involve some sort of doing. Going to church, for example, almsgiving, fasting, these are doing kinds of spiritual practices. We recite prayers, we light candles, we sing, we explore in nature. All of these are ways of engaging our spirituality that involve doing something. And I hope you have several of those practices that help you. They're great. But spirituality isn't just about doing. It is about abiding, about being with God. One of my seminary professors said, a bird is at prayer simply by being a bird. A tree is at prayer simply by being a tree. And the same is true for you, Hilary. You are at prayer simply by being you. Words and actions can be a part of prayer, but they don't have to be. We can pray by simply abiding with God, living with, being still with God. So today I want to remind you of a few being practices that we can all turn to as ways to abide with God. These are very easy. Anyone can do them. And I've discovered that the more time I spent being with God in these ways, the more meaning and peace I found in my life and in these moments. So I'll give you 2 examples today. The first example is called breath prayer. It's very simple. This prayer is focused on your breathing, simply by taking deep breaths and being mindful of them at your own pace. Christians have been praying with their breath for thousands of years, ever since Jesus breathed peace on his disciples and the first contemplatives prayed in the desert. Focus on the breath is an ancient practice that centers us in our bodies and in the present moment. Normally, breathing happens without us having to think about it. But to focus and bring your awareness to the breath is a simple way to abide. So just for a minute, notice your breathing. Once you notice it, you can slow it down, make it deeper. Merely being mindful of our breathing and being aware of our bodies is a way to abide with God. So if you need to pray, you feel like you need to pray, but you can't come up with words, that is a great way to go about it. To sit in quiet and focus on your breathing. Sometimes I'll add words to it, like breathing in. I'm breathing in peace. And as I breathe out, I'm letting go of fear. Things like that. One of the oldest breath prayers is based on the prayer of the tax collector. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Christians have been praying that prayer for thousands of years. The second practice I want to remind you of is centering prayer. And if you've attended our contemplative prayer service on Wednesdays, you will be familiar with it. It's similar to breath meditation, but instead of bringing your focus to your breath, you are bringing your focus to God. To do centering prayer, most people will pick a sacred word or a phrase or a name for God as your anchoring word, your sacred word. And so when you sit in quiet to do centering prayer, like anyone, your mind will wander off to whatever things you need to get done that day or what is waiting on you when you finish this time of prayer. And when you notice your mind wandering, you just go back to that sacred phrase that you picked, bring your attention back to God, and so on, and so forth. The goal isn't to stop thinking. It's simply to always bring your focus back to God when you notice your mind wandering. When I was taught this way of prayer in seminary, our professor had us try it for the first time for 20 minutes. Yeah. That is a very long time to sit still and pray with no words, just bringing your focus back to God every time your mind wanders. So at the end of those 20 minutes, all of us students were looking at each other shamefaced because of how hard it was to do that for 20 minutes. Our minds went all over the place. It was so hard to stay focused. One of my friends fell asleep. The professor had to wake him up. For me, when I was sitting there, I think I had to use my sacred word to bring my focus back from wherever my mind was going, probably at least 2 or 3 times a minute at the very least. And our professor, once this was all over, he just smiled at us. He was so pleased, even though we're all looking around sheepishly, like hiding our faces. And he looked to the guy who fell asleep and he said, "Don't worry, sometimes you fall asleep. That means your body needed rest more than it needed to pray." And then to the rest of us, he says, "How many times did you have to use your sacred word?" And we're looking around all embarrassed. I'm like, 20 minutes, okay, 2 or 3 times a minute, at least 40. And he said, 40, that's wonderful. And I looked to the next person. How many times? Oh, I don't know, at least 60. 60, that's wonderful. And we're just baffled by this. What? We thought we did it wrong. Sometimes some of us, when he would ask, they'd say, "I don't know, I lost count so many times." And he said, "That's great." We were so confused because we felt so ashamed that we couldn't keep our mind focused and that we needed this anchoring word so often. And he looked at us, saw we were confused, and he said, "Don't look at it that way. Think of how pleased God must be, because 60 different times you chose to return. You came back to God." And I never forgot that. Jesus is the true vine, and we are the branches. To bear fruit and bring love to our world, which desperately needs it, we must abide in Christ. Without doing so, we cannot produce that fruit. So finding ways that you can abide with God, to be with God in quiet, is so important. To abide with Christ is to linger, to live, to dwell in the love of God. So find ways to abide in God's love. Take a break once in a while and rest sit in quiet. Stop trying so hard. Simply breathe. Simply be with God. Just abide. And every time, God will rejoice, for once again, you chose to come home.